Welcome to our webinar featuring the New York ISO's 2024 State of the Grid. I'm Mark Levine, and I am the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties and the Executive Director of the Municipal Electric and Gas Alliance, or MEGA. MEGA is a local development corporation created by counties 25 years ago for local governments across the state. MEGA's mission is to use its publicly competitive buying power to minimize and stabilize the cost of electricity and gas for more than 270 member local governments. MEGA and NYISO have a long-standing partnership designed to support the energy transition facing today's local governments. Which brings us directly to our webinar topic today. This session will delve into the latest report from the New York ISO, which highlights growing risks to the electric system reliability driven by rising electricity demands, resource retirements, extreme weather, and other factors. These challenges will persist as more renewable energy resources and large load manufacturing projects, both critical for the state's long-term economic viability, connect to the grid. Join us today with Kevin Lanahan, NYISO's Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications, as he discusses the challenges of the grid and transition and how those challenges may impact New York's counties and local governments. Before we begin, we have a few brief housekeeping announcements. Jeanette Stanziano, NYISO Director of Education and Training. Jeanette.
Thank you, Mark. Just a couple of items to be aware of before we begin. We will be recording this webinar this morning, as we do with all of our sessions, and we will be posting that recording with the PDF of the slide deck on NYISO's website under archived webinars. Just look for today's date. We also want to encourage you at any time during the broadcast to submit questions that you might have for our presenter today. The way to do that is just to refer to your dashboard, click on the questions tab, and type in your questions at that tab link, submit it, and we will get to them at the end of the program. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Kevin Lanahan leads the New York ISO's government relations, stakeholder services, member relations, regulatory affairs, media relations, and corporate communication departments. Mr. Lanahan has more than 20 years of experience in the energy industry and has provided strategic vision and leadership in his previous positions working for Con Ed, JP Morgan Chase & Company, and National Grid. He holds a BA degrees in English and Political Science from SUNY Indiana and an MBA from Norwich University. He is also a graduate of the Harvard Business School and Con Ed's executive management programs. Again, I want to encourage you, we have this expert from the New York ISO on with us today. I encourage you to think about questions as he makes his presentation and go ahead and type them in, and we will get to those questions at the end of his presentation. Kevin Lanahan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's our pleasure. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jeanette, for the help and support. We're pleased to be here. Just want to make sure I have the button to advance the slides. I don't quite see it right now. So if not, I'm going to rely on Jeanette to advance the slides. For those that may not be familiar with the New York Independent System Operator, I'm going to go through quickly a few introductory slides, give you folks an idea of what we do. That there on the slide is a picture of our control center, which is in East Greenbush, New York, directly across the river from the Capitol. A lot of folks aren't aware that the nerve center of the New York State electric system is located in Rensselaer, East Greenbush, New York. But it is the largest control room of its kind. That is where we balance the load with supply and demand, and maintain reliability of the entire electric system in the state of New York. We're going to get to some of those details in a minute. One thing that I do want to point out here is the dedicated workforce that also goes into serving reliability for the state of New York. We have about 600 employees here. And next slide. Our mission and our vision, as I mentioned, reliability is always job one for us, always has been for the last 25 years that we've been in existence. We also feel an obligation and a responsibility to support and try and advance the state climate and energy policies. You see that represented in our mission, and our vision forward-looking is to build the most reliable and cleanest system in the nation. So that also recognizes the aggressive and ambitious state policies that are in place. We're going to get to a slide in a minute here that summarizes what those are for folks. Next slide. So in addition to our mission, there are four, let's say, principles that guide us. And first, as I mentioned, always job one, reliability of the electric system. When those 600 employees pass through the doors of the NYISO every day, this is what they're thinking about. This is, has always been, as I mentioned earlier, job one for us before we put that mission and vision in place. Reliability at the lowest cost possible was our mission. We've amended that a bit. But we also administer and operate open, fair, competitive electric markets in the state. We have the ability to investigate, if you will, and make sure that all market participants operating in those markets are doing so according to the rules. We also, and this is going to be the focus of the discussion today, we are responsible for planning the wholesale bulk electric system. So you see that picture to the right. We operate and are focused on the high voltage electric system. What are the investment needs necessary moving forward in order to keep that system reliable? Look out on a roughly 10-year time horizon, although we're looking out farther now with the passage of the CLCPA that takes us to 2040 and a 2050 decarbonized economy. We've been looking out farther than that average 10 years to see what are the system changes and what investments need to be made in order to maintain reliability, that first principle there. And then the last principle is what we're doing here today, making sure that all the information that our very smart planning engineers, economists have and pour over all day are getting into the hands of folks like you who have a vested interest in the system. We are, in case you aren't aware, one of roughly 9 ISOs or RTOs, another name for our kind of organization, a regional transmission organization in the north, on the continent. So this map represents where the infrastructure and the industry has been deregulated or restructured over the last 20 years. We are the only single state ISO. You see Texas there is almost completely shaded, and California almost completely shaded, but not the entire state. So we enjoy being a single state border-to-border ISO in that there's one set of climate policies that we have to govern to. There's one legislature, whereas some of the RTO, what we call control areas or service territories, if you will, have to balance out several states' different climate policies and political leanings. I want to mention, I forgot earlier that, next slide, please. We are, by our nature, independent. We are, however, heavily regulated. Our chief regulator is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There is some regulatory oversight by the State Public Service Commission, most notably on our budgets and if we seek any borrowing. And there are several reliability organizations that we work closely with that dictate and monitor reliability rules under which we have to operate the system and the markets. You see those represented here, both on a continent basis, a regional basis, and then on a state basis. So it's a multi-layered approach to reliability of the system, several accountabilities, and we like to advertise that we operate the system to the highest and strictest reliability rules in the nation, driven mostly by New York City and everything that we know is important about running that city, the public transit system, Wall Street, et cetera. So we're going to focus on some of those planning reports that I mentioned we are responsible for issuing today. And the first is the Comprehensive Reliability Plan. So this alternates every other year with another reliability report that we issue called the Reliability Needs Assessment. These are mandated by federal tariff. We have to issue these reliability studies. Again, they're done on an annual basis, so we're looking at loads of data that we capture from various different sources, the utilities, NYISO, the Public Service Commission, Standard & Poor's, Moody's. We're grabbing econometrics and that data, make sure that we are keeping apprised of all the changes, not just on the system itself and what the utilities are experiencing, but what's happening in the economy. We're also going to take a look at a report that we issued a few years ago. The company's in the process of updating now, called the System and Resource Outlook. In essence, this was a report intended to identify what are those investment needs necessary to support the state policies, meet the 2030, 2040 goals, while also keeping the system reliable. How much generation, how much transmission, and where is that going to have to be located in order to maintain reliability of the bulk electric system, the high voltage electric system. And then we're going to focus at the end on one of our short-term assessments of reliability reports. We do this on a quarterly basis. I mentioned earlier that we are planning the system since the CLCPA on a 10 to 20 year time horizon by the nature of that law. Well, we're also realized that there's going to be rather quick changes that are happening on the system and in the economy. So we, a couple of years ago, adjusted and said, all right, we're going to issue quarterly updates to see if, make sure that we're capturing those changes almost in real time. So a few key themes that will run throughout the presentation today that also are captured in those three reports that I mentioned that we sourced this presentation on. First, for several years, even before the CLCPA, we were seeing a march in advance of technology. We knew the system was poised to change. We're kind of waving our hands as an organization in issuing these reports and engaging with policymakers and industry leaders, saying, great change is coming and we need to get prepared for it collectively, working together. Well, we are in the middle of that change. I talked about the STAR report, or the short-term assessment of reliability, intended to capture those changes. We are seeing changes on the system in terms of supply and demand and the adoption of new technologies almost on a monthly basis. It's changing the data. And it's being driven by the climate policies of the state, but it's also being driven by the advance of technology and federal policies. And simply, it's driving demand for electricity higher. We are seeing the adoption of electric vehicles. We are seeing the adoption of electric heat. And so those two sectors are really changing how consumers in the state are thinking about and then also consuming electricity. Large loads, what we call large loads, or major economic development projects, are also beginning to drive demand for power higher. We'll talk a little bit about this later on in the presentation. Most notably, we're seeing these large economic development projects in upstate New York, but we are also seeing some interest on chip fab and data centers throughout the state. Generators, traditional thermal generators that have for many decades supplied baseload power are aging and retiring, also retiring in response to some of the state policies. And there's retiring at a faster pace, not commensurate, at a faster pace than the renewable resources are entering service. And we'll get to a specific slide in a second here, but we really need those renewable resources to site and build at a pace commensurate with the retiring traditional generation. And we're seeing an imbalance there. That imbalance is having an impact on something we call reliability margins. Those reliability margins we calculate on a local basis, and they're in a reliability margin is really just excess of megawatts intended to supply the system and meet demand during those times of great consumption. Think about the summer when everybody's turning on their air conditioners, but also during those unforeseen circumstances when maybe a generator goes down that you didn't expect, or a transmission line trips, or we have extreme weather. And that extreme weather we're seeing in both peak seasons now, both winter and summer, of course. So let's pour through a couple of the slides that give us a picture of those changes that I keep talking about. So first, as a primer for folks, this is a bit of a timeline with regard to the CLCPA and some other state policies. So we are very focused as an organization on the 2030 goal, where 70% of the system is supposed to be supplied by renewable energy. You see some of the milestones and markers there to 2040, where the system is supposed to be zero emissions. So we're very focused on those two milestones, not only how to get there in cooperation with stakeholders in the state, but how to do so while also maintaining reliability of the system, avoiding outages, avoiding crisis situations that we've seen with regard to other grids in California, in Texas. We saw some crisis situations in Alberta over the weekend. So places in Canada, the Midwest, and in the South as well. If we go back to last year's Christmas Eve, we saw some natural gas system constraints that while they didn't have an impact in New York per se, it definitely required us to, in real time, shift our control and operation of the system in order to maintain reliability. Next slide. Okay, so this is the slide that I wanted to highlight a moment ago. I mentioned the imbalance that we're observing between new resources, and notably the carbon-free resources siting on and connecting to the system, and the deactivations or the retirement of traditional generation. Simple math there, you see that we're headed in the wrong direction. The story of the grid has always been one of balance, making sure that there's enough resources on the system to balance peak demand. Our peak demand is roughly 34,000 megawatts recorded during the summer season. To have enough resources in order to meet that kind of demand, and then on a statewide basis, but also on a local basis in order to understand those reliability margins on a local basis to fall back on. And this is where our concern is really focused, and what we want people to keep their eye on as we go through the transition to a decarbonized system. This is a busy chart, but I'm going to ask you to focus on, it really is intended to illustrate what we produced in terms of what kind of megawatts from what resources in 2022. We're in the process of calculating this now for 2023, but what I'd really like you to focus on is the smaller donut chart on the right, which we call downstate. So this is roughly the Hudson Valley, Westchester, Orange County, Rockland, Long Island, and the New York City area. So you can see when we think about meeting the 2030, 2040 goals, CLCPA statute in place. Where is most of the work to decarbonize the electric system in order to meet that 2040 goal? It's in those areas I just mentioned. That's where the clear majority, as you see there, of the fossil fuel generation is located in the state. In upstate, we are almost virtually emissions free when you consider how much hydro there is in the system, nuclear, and the growing wind assets that we have in upstate New York. So we really have a tale of two grids in a sense. And this, in addition to pointing out where most of the work to decarbonize the system is going to be focused and located, it also tells the story of the need for transmission infrastructure. And we'll get to that in another slide coming up. So I mentioned that system and resource outlook study that tried to calculate what are the investment needs going forward in order to meet these goals. Quick takeaways here, as I mentioned, our peak load, historic peak load, is just shy of 34,000 megawatts. What we have in the system to use is roughly 37.5 gigawatts, and that's beginning to decline of resources in the system today. By 2030, we calculated through this report, in order to meet reliability, make sure that along the way to 2030, we have the resources necessary. Well, we calculated we would need to build, site, get connected to the system, an additional 20 gigawatts of renewables. So we've still got a ways to go to meet that goal. And then to reach the 2040 goal, you can see the larger number there of gigawatts necessary in the system. One thing that we did point out in this report is that even if we add the roughly 110 gigawatts of capacity needed to meet what we expect to be the system demands, we still don't see a pathway yet to retire all of the existing fossil fuel baseload power from the system. There's got to be some backup to meet those unforeseen circumstances, again, whether that's extreme weather, a spike in demand without being able to rest upon wind or solar because we don't have cooperation from Mother Nature. In order to retire all of that fossil fuel existing baseload power and the system that supplies the fuel for those generators, we would have to come up with a new technology at a commercial scale and get that all sited and connected as well, that have the attributes of that fossil fuel generation. Flexible, fast ramping, reliable for many hours, dispatchable. And we have not, I say we, I mean collectively as a nation, as an industry, as an investment community, we haven't identified those technologies yet that can be developed at scale. We can talk about during the Q&A what those might be. We're keeping a close watch on several different options and the investment and R&D associated with those. So a simple slide to communicate that with all of our reliability reports, we expect to go from a summer peaking system. I mentioned that summer peak, that historic summer peak. We're expecting to become a winter peaking system by 2032, 2033. That could move up or down depending on how the economy and other factors behave in the next several years. But eventually, we anticipate becoming a winter peaking system because of that drive of electric heat and electric vehicles. This is going to cause us, and it is already causing us, to rethink how we operate and plan the system, what we do with regard to forecasting future demand, how to meet that, not just on an annual basis or a seasonal basis, but on a daily basis. We have loads of data on the traditional system, how units operate, what daily weather patterns look like. All of this is changing, and it's going to cause additional challenges as we try and address that winter peak. When we talk about meeting the peak, and when we talk about the future state in terms of winter reliability, we do often get the question, what about behind the meter solar or utility scale solar? Won't that help? And the answer is yes. Behind the meter solar especially is already helping to shave the peak, meet that peak, most notably in summer when we have plentiful sunshine. But the real question is going to be, what happens in winter? We don't have that ability now with the sun setting at 4:30. These days it's around 4:45. And so you don't have that asset to help you after dark. And what we're trying to plan for is the eventual consumer behavior where folks are coming home from work, they're plugging in their electric vehicle after dark, they're walking into the house, turning on their heat pumps to heat up the home, make it comfortable, and they turn on the convection oven or the electric stovetop. And meeting that electric demand means that the peak gets pushed out farther into the evening, and we don't have those renewable assets in terms of the solar that we're able to enjoy today during the summer peaking challenges. Another slide to illustrate what I was just discussing. We are planning for summer demand to increase steadily, and for the daily load, what we call load shapes, to increase steadily. So that's more megawatts being consumed, creating more demand in the summer that we have to plan for in the future. But then also that winter peak exponentially increasing way beyond the 40,000 megawatts I mentioned. We have only 37.5 megawatts in the system these days to choose from. We're going to have to increase the resources necessary to meet both of those peaks, and also plan for those times when Mother Nature doesn't cooperate and we see sudden what we call wind lulls, which I'll discuss a little bit more in a second. So we are steadily adding wind to the system. You see that ramp up there. We have roughly 5,000 megawatts of large-scale wind in the state to choose from. But we do see wind lulls, and we put a report out in 2023 discussing some of these observations and studies that we've observed wind lulls of up to 3 days in length, as many as 3 times a year. So planning for that, especially when we consider the offshore wind goals that the state has put in place, we are going to have to account for those times when we can't rest on the wind. The other issue is, especially with the upstate wind that we have in place, especially in summer, the transmission system gets constrained. We've got a lot of resources in upstate New York, a lot of clean resources in upstate New York. The challenge of getting all of that power down to the load centers of New York City, Long Island, Westchester County, the Hudson Valley on a daily basis creates constraints on the transmission system. And that means sometimes we can't take all of the wind that's being generated, which means that we need to invest in additional transmission capability to avoid those constraints and be able to take all of that decarbonized wind when it is available and distribute it across the state. Next slide. This illustrates the progress, though, that we have made on transmission investments. And I want to point out the Champlain Hudson Power Express line, which is intended to deliver 1,250 megawatts of clean hydro out of Quebec down, inject directly into New York City. That's that fuzzy light blue line that begins at the beyond the border, northern border of New York there. But the yellow shades are newly constructed transmission lines that on the left, unbottle, what we say, unbottle more of the Niagara power clean hydro, gives us the ability to transfer that across that network down to those load centers in the southern part of the state, and then alleviating additional constraints, roughly Syracuse east to Albany and down through the Hudson Valley. Those projects are either done or almost done and have already improved our capability to move power around the state. But we're going to need more, as I pointed out in that previous slide. We're going to need to invest in more and more dynamic transmission capability to meet the 2030 and 2040 goals. So I'm going to focus on a recent STAR report that we issued in 2023. This will give you a picture of the nature of the changes in the system, how quickly these are happening, and the importance of these STAR reports. In New York City, we did identify that those reliability margins that I talked about up front in the presentation had declined on a local basis to a point where we found an official reliability violation of 446 megawatts. So that means that when we ran the modeling for New York City in the summer of 2025, we saw that the system on that localized basis was short 446 megawatts to meet the expected demand. So that's an issue where when we find that deficiency, we have to solve for it. There's a process I'll detail in a second to do so. And the deficit was, again, being driven by the advance of technology, the adoption of electric vehicles, as well as heat pumps, believe it or not, in and around New York City. People are installing those in the 5 boroughs. And it's also being driven by the retirement of smaller scale fossil fuel, what we call peaker plants. These are plants that are basically in standby. They sit on barges in New York City, and they're used to shave those peak demands during the highest consumption and highest demand days. We don't run them, we don't own them, and we do not run them unless it's absolutely necessary. They're a last resort, if you will. And there are regulations in place that have led to the retirement of more than 1,000 megawatts of these peaker plants because they've been identified as inefficient, older, highest emitting. So we do want to exit them from the system, but don't want to do so unless we can fill in the gap once those units leave with some other resource. And again, this is illustrating the imbalance that's happening as we go through the transition of the system. Not enough resources are connecting commensurate with the retirement of those plants. So there was when we identified this reliability need, we said we're going to have to hold on to roughly 650 megawatts of additional peakers that are intended to retire in 2025 until we can solve for this reliability need. In addition, this recent STAR report identified that we are starting to see some of the same issues for different reasons in upstate New York with regard to reliability margins there and on a statewide basis. And I'll detail that in a second. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Champlain Hudson Power Express project on the transmission map. For those folks that are familiar with that project, again, it's going to be critical that it stays, the construction stays on time. It's intended, and we're in close contact with the developers to electrify in the summer of 2026. This will be what we hope a permanent solution to that New York City reliability need I just illustrated. And this bar chart is really just intended to show that without Champlain Hudson, we are going to have additional and definitely more serious acute reliability issues to plan for and try and solve in the New York City area. So in simple terms, this slide really shows us how critical Champlain Hudson will be to stay on schedule with the construction. And the next slide further illustrates without it. And so this communicates the issue in New York City without Champlain Hudson, but this also shows us that if that project doesn't stay on time, can't electrify by 2026, there's likely going to be redounding impacts on the entire system and the upstate system as well. And that's one of the things that our future planning studies are really focused on, trying to account for, because this is the responsible way forward. If that project doesn't connect on time, what will be the impacts across the state and across the system, not just in New York City. So this is roughly the process we have of solving for a reliability need once we identify one. In this case, in New York City, once we declared the need back in July of 2023, we then began work immediately with the incumbent utility. In this case, it's Con Edison. But if we identify a need elsewhere in the state, it could be National Grid, it could be Avangrid or NYISO. At the same time, we put a call out to the marketplace. Are there companies that have engineering ideas, solutions, and investments that they think can help us solve the need? Well, we wanted to look at all possibilities. And if there was not one, then maybe there was a suite of possibilities from several different developers that we could look at. In this case, we only saw 2 proposals come forward. Neither were sufficient or viable. In that case, that did lead us to the call for holding on to those peaker plants for at least a 2-year time frame, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so I do want to focus a little bit more on that statewide reliability margin issue. So this shows with anticipated large loads that we could have reliability needs on a statewide basis in upstate New York. Again, sort of the same scenario that we would have to solve for, but for different reasons. It's a good news, bad news story in terms of the fact that the system is reacting and responding in this way. But part of the reason in upstate New York that we're seeing some of these deficiencies is increased economic development interest. So upstate New York hasn't seen this kind of interest in 40 years. So that's the good news story, is that we're seeing companies wishing to site and build new facilities, new manufacturing facilities or chip fabs, data centers in places like, of course, Micron in Syracuse, but also interest in Rochester and the stamping plant in Western New York. What we need to do is make sure that we are siting new resources at a quicker pace in order to make up for the expected or possible reliability margin decreases. We also have to keep our eye on the existing resources that are supplying upstate New York. Those are aging, and so we've got to make sure that those aging plants and the maintenance there is being maintained and careful. Those are the units that are going to help us attract additional economic development, give the confidence necessary going forward that we can meet that uptick in demand. So that was a lot. I will take questions, and we always throw this slide up at the end because there's a load of additional material on our website for folks to access that can, including those reliability reports that we spoke from today, to help you understand the quick changing nature of the system, what we do here, and what we're doing on your behalf to try and maintain reliability through this great transition being driven by state policies. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. There's a lot there and some red flags. I want to hop on this slide that you're presenting right now. I've spent quite a bit of time on your website recently in preparation for this webinar, and there's a lot of great material there. So I do encourage our members and attendees to take a look at what's on the ISO website. There's a lot for policymakers to digest. So thank you. And there was a lot for us to digest in your presentation today. I'm going to start with questions that were submitted by our attendees. I also have some questions. At this time, I would encourage other attendees who have not submitted questions but have questions. Jeanette, could you please leave that slide on? Thank you. To at this time submit questions as they come up. First, do you believe that it is actually possible to meet all of our current and future needs only through renewables? Should there also be a greater effort towards carbon capture and not just avoidance, Kevin?
Yeah, our point of view when we get these kinds of questions is that the future state is going to include a number of different and a number of diverse types of resources. So we spent roughly 120 years building a system with, although we've got diverse resources here in New York, especially with hydro and nuclear, an expected number of resources that would run for a long time. You didn't have to think very hard about. The future state is going to be a number of different diverse resources that run on different types of fuels. And so carbon capture, yeah, that's likely to be part of the solution, part of the mix. There's a number of different approaches, whether we're talking about carbon capture or sequestration, battery operated storage, or green blue hydrogen possibilities in R&D that we keep our eye on. We get several presentations from developers who come to us and say, we've been running this resource for this long and we'd like to bring to you the takeaways and some of the data. We're always excited to understand what that looks like, because we expect those kinds of resources to show up in our markets eventually. But that future state, it's going to be several different resources, more so on a localized basis, filling in those gaps when the wind doesn't blow or the sun isn't shining, that are flexible, fast ramping. And our operators, and this is part of our challenge with the future state, our operators are going to have to be quick to make those adjustments, plan for those changes, not just in system demand with the diverse resources, but with the change in weather. The extreme weather is also making our challenges even greater.
Great, thank you very much. So one of your earlier slides said we need 20 gigawatts of new renewable projects by 2030. Can you talk a little bit about that and the interconnection issue to the grid? What are the enhancements that have been made? Are there enhancements on the horizon? When a new renewable project comes online, it's got to be connected to the grid. So can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, sure thing. So there's probably no higher priority for us than the interconnection process, making it as easy and efficient and as quick as possible. But also we have to keep in mind that it has existed and it exists still today, to make sure that once a resource or a number of different resources looking to connect to the system at one time, and we see that a lot these days, right? A group of resources shows up and says, we want to connect all in roughly the same time frame, that when those connect at various different interconnection points on the system and begin to inject new electrons onto the grid, that everything still stays reliable. And so the interconnection process needs to be quick, easy, efficient, but it also it cannot miss anything. We can't cut corners. So, but we've got a number of different initiatives in place or in flight to achieve that efficiency that I'm talking about. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission also issued an order last year to push the RTOs and the ISOs across the country to reform their processes. We had several different initiatives already in flight that showed up in that FERC order, so we sort of had a head start. A couple of details to directly answer your question. First of all, we've added several new planning engineers, and that was essential to make sure that we had more people on the case, pouring through the documents, trying to move the system resource impact studies that are necessary for developers through as quickly as possible. Make sure that they're also looking hard at the details there to ensure reliability. We also, long before the FERC order, began a stakeholder process, so held several different meetings and task forces with stakeholders, developers, policymakers, the state entities, to say, how do we put together a new approach to what was our class year approach? So a number of different projects all step over the line and elect to move forward together and connect to the system, as I said earlier, in relatively the same time frame. This, what we call a cluster approach, will be ongoing instead of one group moving through the process and confronting those situations where if a few developers lag behind, it kind of brings the whole group behind as well. We will have an ongoing, what FERC calls the cluster approach. And if certain numbers of developers can't make progress or need to pause to go redo engineering studies, reconsider the interconnection point, redo financing, that does not slow down the others. The others can continue to move through the process and get to the end point. So again, we're not done with our reforms. We're not done with making improvements, but in a nutshell, that's where we're focused. And we're excited about it. We understand how important it is both to the investment community, the development community, and the state.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of nuclear power in the grid's future?
Well, there's an awful lot of discussion that is getting louder across the country, and I think fair to say the globe, about the importance of nuclear power. I'm looking at so I've got a screen on my wall that shows me the current resource mix. It's a bit of a cold day, so we're a bit higher than we normally would be. 21,000, roughly 300 megawatts of demand on the system. 3,300 megawatts are being supplied by nuclear. So it's incredibly important that baseload power that remains after the retirement of Indian Point. It's emissions free and it runs very reliably. So that's that. And then when we think about the future state of nuclear and the opportunities, smaller scale nuclear is something that I think the state is considering in terms of options moving forward. You see some of those discussions popping up, and then across the country too. Can we create and site smaller nuclear facilities that can, as we were talking about in several of these slides, fill in those gaps when we see those, for instance, wind lulls? That's something that I think that discussion is getting louder.
On the same topic, does ISO or do you have a position on financial incentives for new nuclear plants, whether it's small nuclear or otherwise? It is clean energy and far more reliable and manageable than solar or wind. So does ISO have a position on incentivizing the creation of new nuclear?
So a couple things to highlight. One, if we harken back to that mission slide, again, reliability is job one, and it does reflect the work that we're doing to help move the public policies of the state forward. We made that change a few years ago because it didn't make any sense for us to ignore that that's the statute and the law of the land. However, we do, especially in the administration of our markets, we do maintain resource neutrality, and we look at resources from the standpoint of what is the most reliable and what does provide consumers the lowest cost. And so from that transparent, independent administration of the markets, we take no position on subsidies or specific policies. But I can tell you our control room operators really do like the dispatchability elements and characteristics of nuclear.
I'm sure they do. That's a fair response. Thank you. From nuclear to wind, a number of promising offshore wind projects are not going forward for various reasons. How can we resolve that? What should the state do?
Yeah, I failed to mention on that transmission slide the transmission that's going to be critical to connect up to 12,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So we're watching, just like everybody else, the process between the PSC, NYSERDA, and the developers rerun those bids. We're anxious to see how that proceeds and what the outcomes will be there. We have a role in helping the state, once they declare a public policy need on a transmission corridor, to analyze all of the projects that get proposed to satisfy that public policy need. So the State Public Service Commission will run a process where they look at transmission corridors in the state, and if they see that there's transmission investments necessary to connect, for instance, in this case, the offshore wind, they will declare a public policy need. The process more or less gets shifted over to us. We collect the bids, the proposals, we pour through this again is a responsibility for our really smart planning engineers. They pour through all of the proposals, determine which are the most viable and sufficient, and then name those and send it back over to the Public Service Commission, where the Article 7 permitting process then commences. And even though there's been some bumps in the road and some pauses with the offshore wind recs and those bids, we are proceeding without pause on with our role and our responsibility of identifying those best proposals to connect all that offshore wind. Our thinking, and we've had discussions with the state on this, everybody agrees, is that we should continue to move forward as quickly as possible, and identify those sufficient and viable projects, get those sited and built as quickly as possible, so that when the offshore wind when those turbines get sited out there in the Long Island Bight, the transmission is already there to connect back to the system on terrestrial land.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I have a number of other questions. I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your answers, Kevin. To our audience, if you have additional questions, please submit them as soon as you can. Do your estimates of new renewables needed fully take into account reductions possible through ramped up conservation efforts, i.e. Properly insulating buildings, etc.? You guys are definitely doing a lot of environmental scanning and future scoping. Does it include conservation?
Yeah, great question. So the short, simple answer is yes. We engage, I'm going to describe hopefully quickly here our stakeholder process. So we don't go behind closed doors with our eye shades on and put together these reports. Before we even begin to put pen to paper, the first thing we're doing is in our open, what we call governance process, where all industry stakeholders, and that includes, again, the developers, the generators, the state entities, advocates, both on the consumer side, the environmental and the environmental justice side, everybody collects here, and sort of I describe it as a mini legislature. And before we put pen to paper, we're asking those stakeholders, are we approaching this report the right way? Here are the scenarios we intend to run. Here are the assumptions and the inputs. Is this the full suite and the fully realized universe of those assumptions? I can tell you those discussions are robust, and just as we have experts here at the NYISO, the experts in the governance process make us even better, because they're challenging us and they're saying, count this, don't forget about that. We grab all of that efficiency data from the utilities. We want to understand what their programs are, how they're being run, and what those programs are resulting in. Capturing that data, putting it into our reports. We also are working with NYSERDA to understand what programs they're running. Where is the money going? How is it being spent? What are the results of those programs? And capturing all that data and putting it into those scenarios and in those reports. So hopefully that helps answer that question. So, and in detail, because you mentioned the insulation issue, those programs that NYSERDA is running that are relatively new, these are new sort of efficiency programs with new funding behind them in the last several budget cycles. We are digging in with NYSERDA to understand how that's going and how to capture that work.
Great, thank you. And we will have a NYSERDA webinar in a couple of weeks to talk about their Clean Communities program. Can you comment on the distributed renewable energy resources and especially the potential of thermal energy networks to reduce demand on the grid and meet local needs?
I can only say that it's interesting because those thermal networks is something that a new member of what we call our Environmental Advisory Committee, Julie Tai, who heads up the League of Conservation Voters, is very focused on. So she's been helpful in terms of bringing that discussion to bear here at the NYISO. I can't comment on it specifically other than we're very focused on it. And we understand that in addition to that kind of future state I described earlier, we've got several different resources providing power in several different ways. We also are anticipating going forward there being microgrids and thermal networks and those kinds of adjustments to the distribution system and the transmission system that are likely in a 2040, 2050 grid New York State economy state. So it's definitely something we're focused on.
Great, thank you. With the aggressive goal of 100% renewable generation by 2040 and the unlikelihood that new reliable renewables like hydro will be sited in New York, is it realistic that the 2040 goal will be met? If not, is the backup plan essentially to import power from Hydro-Quebec to meet the 2040 mandate of the state?
Yeah, we get this kind of question a lot, and we're focused on what do we need to do to keep the system reliable from now to 2040, from now to 2030. If we do fall short of these goals, we expect the policymakers to deal with and address that. We're focused on making sure the system stays reliable, and then how to also at the same time commensurate with the divestitures we're seeing, going back to the interconnection process discussion we had. How do we cite enough resources to make up for that gap? So we're focused on running the system, operating the system, keeping it reliable, advancing the projects through the queue. It's not to say we don't ignore that those goals are in statute, but if we're doing our job, we're helping the policymakers understand what's happening on the system on a quarterly basis so that they then can make decisions on a policy going forward that need to address those milestones.
Yeah, you mentioned you're watching these things as they unfold. Are these policy makers also watching your reports and making decisions based on your estimations going forward?
That's a great question. I appreciate that question. More and more, yes. We have been for the last several years now, especially since 2019, thinking hard about how to reach lawmakers, policymakers. We have robust engagement, I would say, with the relevant state agencies, Public Service Commission, NYISO, speak to the governor's office frequently, the Department of Environmental Conservation, of course. Our phone has been ringing a lot, say in the last couple of years, more and more from lawmakers across the state, those folks in the city that want to understand what happened with that reliability need, folks in upstate New York, a little different view generally on the way forward, and are now starting to come up to speed with this dynamic that I mentioned with regard to economic development, future economic development load. So we are busy in terms of engaging with the full suite of policymakers, and it's essential and necessary.
Well, we will do our part and promote the recording of this webinar as far and wide as we possibly can. So we appreciate that. Do you think it makes sense to remove a carbon sink or clear cut a forest and replace it with solar panels?
That's not something that would necessarily be in our purview. So I can't say whether it would make sense or it doesn't make sense. If it showed up on in our interconnection queue, that's where we would engage on a project like that.
Do plans to remove transmission constraints, which will allow upstate generators to sell power downstate, include Marcy?
Well, I guess generally, that would be determined by, if I understand the question correctly, the investments and the interconnection. But it's that in and around Marcy, and I know that there's some work there, but those kinds of questions, there's so many variables. What time of the year, what are the system conditions, and so it's hard to speak to in generalities like that, okay, unfortunately.
But I do have some specific questions here. If you don't mind, I'll just fire them off. Where will the power come from for operating Micron when it is built?
That is the question that we are hoping to help answer going forward. As I think everybody understands, that project is endeavoring to be to use renewables and I think to be carbon neutral. So we are endeavoring to try and help answer the question that was just put forward, but also that paradigm. It is a very big project, 450 megawatts, I believe, is the first chip fab that is now in our interconnection queue. So we're working closely with the developer, Empire State Development, and very focused on how to answer that question.
Thank you. You talked about reliability margins when it comes to New York City. If the Champlain transmission project doesn't come online by 2026, where will New York City get its electricity?
Well, I'll speak to I'll amend the question if I can in this way. How will we continue to meet that reliability need? And the answer there would be to extend the peakers that we just held in place after 2025 for a 2-year time frame, for a second 2-year time frame. That is pursuant to the DEC's emissions rule. It says there's a 2-year time frame where we can keep those plants online, try and solve that need. And then to the question, if we aren't able to solve it because Champlain Hudson, which we assume to be the permanent solution, doesn't electrify in 2026, we would very likely start having discussions and running analysis to see if the peaker plants are necessary for another 2-year time frame.
Great, thank you. What role does the ISO play in demand response, and could our counties do you recommend our counties participate in these demand response requests?
So, yeah, good question. We do have our own demand response programs. Typically, those are run when demand is really beginning to peak. It's on a wholesale level. So I don't know offhand. Forgive me. We'll try and run this down. If those programs that you're talking about on a county basis are eligible, or that would be a nexus strictly with the incumbent utility.
Okay, great. Thank you. You've answered all our questions. Any 1 minute to wrap up, Kevin, would be great.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for this opportunity. Again, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jeanette. I want to stress that we consider our role as independent administrators of the system and the markets to be one of service to all stakeholders and all consumers in the state. And we don't intend for these messages to be absorbed as a commentary on the policies per se, but more so on how we can get to a 2030 goal and a 2040 goal, decarbonizing the system, transforming the grid and the economy in the most reliable fashion forward. Hopefully that comes through from the discussion in the slides today. And again, I just appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely, thank you. On behalf of the Municipal Electric and Gas Alliance and the New York State Association of Counties, Kevin, I want to thank you and your team, including Andrew Gregory, for helping to educate our members about the grid and what's happening today with this energy transition. Thank you all and have a great day.